I'm half Canadian and I partially grew up there, and hearing Americans talk about the country always left me conflicted. Until a couple years ago, Americans and Europeans, largely of a left-leaning persuasion, treated Canada as if it was a land of milk and honey, some left-wing post-racial paradise. However, I knew that wasn't true. Now Canadians and Americans, more on the right, treat Canada like it's some horrifying Maoist state, which also isn't true. With this whole business with the truckers and its reaction to the COVID pandemic in general, we see the tension that have existed in Canada the whole time. Thus, I think it's timely to talk about a potential future that Americans and Canadians rarely think about, that the chances are very good that Canada won't survive the next few decades. This is a video to talk about the future of Canada and the paths that could result in that nation's end. Canada is often overlooked as a nation, but the country is a pretty solid secondary power that's been involved in several major events throughout history, many of which you can see in the Magellan documentary series Canada: The Story of Us. This documentary goes over the history of Canada from its birth as a collection of British colonies to its involvement in modern events like World War II and the Cold War. Watching this series can give insights into some of the issues Canada faces today, as well as shed light on what they've contributed to many of the great events in world history, such as the World Wars. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service made by filmmakers of the best selection of historical documentaries and movies out there. They have content covering everything from the ancient world to current events and from true crime to astronomy. Magellan is compatible with just about any device and is 4K HD with no additional cost. It's a great platform for an affordable price. I absolutely love Magellan and all the historical, scientific, and cultural documentaries they offer. Covering such a wide variety of topics, Magellan is something for everyone. As well as this, they're offering a 1-month free deal for anyone who clicks the link in the description. So go to Magellan TV and set up an account today. Most international left-wingers treat Canada as some paradise of left-wing politics that really doesn't exist. Canada is a nation like any others with skeletons, problems, and political compromises. In order to understand how Canada could possibly fall apart, we need to look at Canada's fundamental problems and positions as a nation, and how Canada as of now is run. In order to see Canada as it really is, not as it would like to be seen, we need to understand 3 fundamental political truths of Canada. The first is its similarity to the United States. Anglo-Canada is an extension of the United States. After the American Revolution, the Loyalists who didn't like the Revolution immigrated to Canada. Most of the Loyalists came from the middle states like Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, giving much of Anglo-Canada a culture similar to those states. The cultural similarities between Canada and the United States are beyond close. Canadians talk the same, eat the same food, go to the same churches, watch the same movies, and the list goes on endlessly. Each Canadian province has more in common with the American state opposing it than with the other provinces, or even regional differences inside America. I mean, genetically, Anglo-Canadians are an extension of the northern United States, while American Southerners could count as a separate ethnic group. As an example, the area of Canada I lived in, southern Ontario, was settled from the area in America I'm from, southeastern Pennsylvania, and so I would see many of the same street names and architecture in both places. The cultural similarities to America have created one of the major crises in Canadian identity, of how to differentiate it from the United States. Before 1960, this was largely done through Canada's Britishness. However, after the 1960s, as the Quebecois emerged into greater political consciousness, Canadians needed to find a new way to justify their identity. Now, it's that they're the better left-wing alternative to America. Canada is an incredibly bizarre country in that its nationalists are urban and left-wing rather than rural and conservative like they are in most countries. Which brings us to the second main geopolitical problem in Canada, the geographic differences inside Canada. 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, and Canada is a long strip which makes constructing a centralized national core impossible. Each Canadian province has very different cultures and interests. For a brief summary from west to east, British Columbia is like California, Alberta is like Texas, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are like Nebraska or South Dakota, Ontario is like New York or Ohio, Quebec is, well, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces are like New England. Meanwhile, the northern areas like Yukon or Nunavut are extremely lightly populated, often inhabited by indigenous tribes. Canada is divided geographically between the massive Rocky Mountains splitting British Columbia, the Canadian Shield, or a massive rocky wasteland splitting the plains from Ontario, and a bunch of uninhabited forests splitting the Maritimes off. However, for a simple definition, Canada is split geographically east and west by the Canadian Shield. Quebec is the third major problem with Canada in that 1/4 of Canada's population is French-speaking. Another important thing is that outside Quebec, there's very little intermingling between French and English speakers. Living in Ontario, I've only ever seen one French speaker outside Quebec. The vast majority of Anglo-Canadians speak no French. The Quebecois are very much a separate nation, and they act like it. The Quebecois are very nationalist, partially due to centuries of oppression at the hands of English speakers, demand various concessions from the Anglo government. They make various grandstanding gestures like demanding French be the only official language in Quebec, or demanding French be used across the whole country, even in areas where there are basically no French speakers. Quebec has threatened independence multiple times, getting remarkably close to achieving it in the 1960s, 80s, and 90s. One of the few things non-Canadians know is that Canada has come inches from civil wars multiple times in the 20th century. What happened is that the central Canadian government has basically bribed Quebec to stay in the country, giving it large payments from the rest of the nation. The combination of the Quebec difficulties and the geographic differences means that Canada is a collection of loose alliances that keeps the nation together. Some examples are how Alberta and Quebec are allied against Ontario, or Ontario and Quebec are allied against the West. These alliances are more vital than you'd probably think. Within 1980, when Quebec nearly seceded, the Plains provinces said that they'd rather join America than stay in a country ruled by Ontario. The Quebec difficulties had been papered over with the Laurentian Alliance, kind of developed in the 1980s and 90s, that was pioneered by the elder Trudeau or Justin Trudeau's father. This was effectively an alliance of Ontario and Quebec with the Maritimes as attachés against Western Canada. Those two provinces have over half of Canada's population. Both Ontario, or more properly Toronto and its suburbs, as well as Quebec, are socially liberal, and formed a coalition against the more conservative West. Meanwhile, the Maritimes are poor and deindustrialized, and are kept part of the coalition through welfare payments. I'm oversimplifying here. The social and economic divide between East and West Canada has stood since the mid-19th century, and has been marred by long-standing bitterness and dislike inside the relationship that's bordered on colonial between the more populated industrial East and the resource-producing West. As mentioned before as well, this is compounded by the natural geographic split between the two regions. When we look at the ruling Canadian clique and classes, we see the effects of the Laurentian Compromise. The alliances of left-wing regions has kept Canadian politics to the left of the United States, with the Conservative Party very moderate by the standards of the US Republican Party, and even to the left of the average Canadian conservative voter, since the national consensus is left-wing. When you look at the bulwark of the Liberal Party, it's a left-wing suburban and urban demographic clustered around cities like Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. The Canadian Liberal Party has been able to maintain its power even after horribly embarrassing events, since this core demographic is the same one as Canadian nationalism, and to vote Conservative would be a betrayal of Canada's left-wing mission. An important point to consider is that both American and Canadian nationalism are fundamentally middle-class movements. However, due to the very different foundations of both countries, with the conservative loyalists making Canada and the radical at the time rebels in America making that country, it's resulted in American nationalism being fundamentally right-wing and built around liberty, while Canadian nationalism is fundamentally left-wing and built around order. Thus, when you look at Canadian nationalists and the ruling elite do stuff, they often do things that from an American perspective look like destroying freedoms. However, from a Canadian perspective, which is more in line with Europe, they're trying to install order and regain social control and cohesion. When we look at Trudeau's reaction to the truckers protesting the vaccine mandate for their profession, involving breaking many legal freedoms like freezing their bank accounts, calling a state of emergency to drive them out, or trying to destroy their camp, you're watching a symbolic representation of the Laurentian liberal elite undemocratically trying to hold power of the conservative West, where the trucker movement started. I think the present moment where the left-wing Trudeau administration is dishonoring itself is the perfect vantage point to view the further decline of the Canadian order. For people who haven't been paying attention, the Canadian left has been horribly abusing its power over the last few years. Some examples of this involve throwing the leader of a major right-wing opposition party in jail for being maskless in an outdoor political rally. Another is that if you're entering Canada and they don't like your quarantine plan for whatever reason, the border officers could put you in a literal government camp without a trial. The Canadian Parliament passed a bill making it illegal to not use someone's preferred pronouns, and they tried to pass a bill to hurt freedom of speech for Canadian YouTubers. The government kept Canada under quarantine and lockdown while over 70% of the population was vaccinated. This doesn't even include the previous corruption and abuses seen among the liberal elite beforehand, like the Lavalin scandal and the WE charity event. Alternatively, how a prime minister obsessed with political correctness has a history of doing blackface and other similar cultural misappropriations. Speaking of that, political correctness is much worse in Canada than the United States, mostly focusing upon Indigenous issues. At the turn of the 20th century, Canada had a policy of forcibly placing Indigenous children in government schools to assimilate them. When one of these schools was discovered and found, it created an immense national mourning, with city bells tolling, schools commemorating the event, etc., before the case was even investigated. The irony here is that Canada had by far the best relations with Indigenous peoples of any nation in the New World. There was only one Indian war in Canadian history, and the colonization process was mostly peaceful. In a country like the United States with its history of breaking Indian treaties and straight-up genocide, this self-flagellation would be a lot better placed. As an immense irony, I remember my sister's college of University of Toronto, arguably Canada's best university, made a whole thing of honoring the Haudenosaunee as the true owners of Toronto at every public event. The truth is that the Huron are the original inhabitants of Toronto, and the Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois, drove them out and committed genocide against them during the Beaver Wars in the late 17th century. Meanwhile, the British colonization of the region was mostly peaceful and done by treaty, with the Iroquois as their allies. Canada's got a strange postmodern cultural consensus. Take the Wet'suwet'en pipeline as a keystone example in which the democratically elected tribal leaders of that nation voted to allow the pipeline, but then protesters tried to shut it down with the argument that the true representatives of the Wet'suwet'en nation were the hereditary tribal chiefs, with the democratic institutions being part of the settler nature of Canada and thus illegitimate. The historic irony being that chiefs were also formally created by European colonization, and there really wasn't a formalized government before white colonialism. A consensus among the modern Canadian ruling class is that tribal peoples can act as they wish, independent of the central Canadian government's law, due to Canada itself being an illegitimate creation of conquest. Justin Trudeau and his clique have made statements along the lines that Canada has no national identity, that Canadian values do not exist, and that Canada must keep taking new immigration. They believe in a sort of postmodernist state beyond ethnicity, that which has no parallel across all of history, and has only its closest parallels in giant empires run by coherent and oppressive elites like Austro-Hungary or the Mughal. That's probably since the Canadian political elite must be bilingual by law, a group that's less than 20% of Canada's population, and must be comfortable in both French and Anglo-Saxon culture. A good friend of mine is probably the most important Canadian political YouTuber, JJ McCullough, who helped me write this episode, and he made a video about how Canada has failed in that Canada has had 3 goals across its history, of keeping the French in, the Americans out, and the Indians down. However, that Canada has failed at all 3 and is now losing its identity. The radicalism of the Canadian elite makes sense through this prism, given that elites that have a weak right to rule often act arbitrarily and abusively to hold on to their power. This perspective highlights the postmodernism of the Canadian ruling class, given that relying on any of Canada's national identities, rather than pitting them against each other to maintain balance of power, results in Canada's collapse. The endpoint of Anglo-Canadian nationalism is joining the US, and French-Canadian nationalism is Quebec gaining independence, which would result in the end of a coherent Canada. I think the reason they're emphasizing native nationalism to the degree they are is that it's a movement that, due to the tiny amount of natives in Canada, at less than 5% of the population, that can be easily co-opted. If 95% of Canadians are alienated from their identities, and that 5% is bought off as part of the ruling coalition, then Canada needs its ruling class. What I'm trying to say here is that the current compromise and group who runs Canada are losing their legitimacy through corruption. In my video on social justice, I came to the conclusion that the movement would self-destruct over the next few decades, and this process would also occur in Canada with their left, but the problem is that their left is the force that holds their country together. I feel kinda silly saying the Canadian elite's abusing its power, given that from history's perspective, its flaws appear beyond mild. It's not like British India, which let tens of millions die of famine without lifting a hand, or modern Burma, which is committing genocide against its Rohingya minority, is a military dictatorship and tries to consign other minorities like the Karen and Shan to state-sponsored serfdom. However, the role of the state is to serve the nation, and no matter how well-intended the failure is, whether through forcing Confucian values or multiculturalism, if it doesn't align with the nation's interest, it still fails. As my friend JJ said, a polite, clean, and friendly Canadian totalitarianism is still a totalitarianism. Another important factor that I've almost never seen talked about is Canada's recent good fortune, or how it hasn't fallen to populism like the United States or Europe, is that people act like it's some inherent good nature of the Canadian people. The truth is that Canada's political stability is caused more by high resource prices. Canada is at heart a colonial economy, and that its economy is in many ways driven by selling resources to the rest of the world. To their good luck, the last few decades have seen massive economic growth in the developing world that have kept resource prices high. We see similar trends occurring in Latin America, Australia, and New Zealand with high resource prices. In Europe and America now, a big driver behind the current social problems is deindustrialization. In the resource-producing countries, it's largely been by the downturn of prices driven by China's economic slowdown. This was largely manifested in Canada, Latin America, and Australia by growing big government leftist power, as people turned to the left to keep giving out money so that people could maintain the standards of living they had when resource prices were higher. The later start for Canadian political populism explains why Canada's anti-immigrant backlash hasn't happened yet, while nativist parties happened earlier in the US and Europe. Having lived in both countries, the idea that Canadians are inherently more tolerant or open-minded than Americans just isn't true. In Canada, the pie was growing for longer, so immigrants weren't seen as infringing on local resources. However, I don't see any way due to their sheer numbers that immigration doesn't become a major political issue in Canada. For example, the Greater Toronto area is majority immigrant and Vancouver's 40%. However, as my predictions have laid out, it seems likely that the world economy and political system is going to see troubles over the next few decades that will depress the world economy and probably resource prices at some point. The only exception would be a world war that would shoot resource prices through the roof. Okay, now let's imagine a Canada where the current left-wing leadership has discredited itself through continuing its corrupt and immoral ways. This Canada has seen a strong populist right akin to Trump or Marine Le Pen arise with a powerful nativist agenda. The leadership of the Canadian Conservative Party has been moderate and centrist to a fault, not being able to garner any dynamism. As an example of this future trend, just look at how the Conservatives removed Erin O'Toole for being too boring, for lack of a better term. The thing to consider about Canada is that it will splinter without too much strain put on it. I mean, the 20th century was a very easy century for Canada, all things considered, and Quebec nearly split off several times. However, demographic factors are going to make this a harder century for Canada. Now is the part of the video where I inevitably talk about demographics. Canadian demographics are very stark in that the East is very old and getting older, with Eastern Canada having birth rates and average ages at the same range as Western Europe. Western Canada, meanwhile, is the youngest area in the Western world with a growing population. As I've said countless times before in this channel, demographics drives politics in countries with collapsing populations of horrible futures. A nation with an aging population doesn't have money to start new businesses, wage wars, or birth children, ending up in a consuming black hole. We're already seeing the start of this trend in Japan today. Already today, the wealthier and growing Western Canada sends Eastern Canada money and subsidies. This will only get worse, and as it does, alongside the stark political difference, in which in many places in the prairie provinces the Conservatives get 98% of the vote, will get worse. Alberta is a major oil-producing province, and their main market is the United States. An interesting story I like to tell is the Standing Rock pipeline, in which the Albertans were in a trade war with their rival British Columbia, and so couldn't get their oil to the Pacific, and so tried to route it through the Texas oil fields. However, since the land passed through a region ceded by the Lakota and North Dakota in 1876, it became a symbolic issue for the American left, which prevented its creation. There are a couple different historic cycles that work largely through demographic and economic trends and are extremely complicated to predict, but both the Turchin and Strauss-House cycles predict the US will have a golden age towards the middle of the century. Whenever the US has faced golden ages, it's expanded geographically, whether in the early 19th century or in the 1940s, and so annexing more territory wouldn't be out of character. The US is a young country and won't face the same aging crises as the rest of the world, and this would come at the same time as Eastern Canada's aging and economic collapses. A big reason Canadians are averse to joining America now is that the US is a dysfunctional mess, but if the US was in a golden age, it would make sense for the prairie provinces to join a US that shares their more conservative values and is also their biggest oil and grain market. They'd probably join America since as independent nations, they would totally be at the mercy of negotiations with the Americans, but as parts of America, they would get better deals for their resources. This is one option. The other is that by this point, the Canadian project is facing so much stress that Quebec would secede. However, both results would effectively result in the tapestry of alliances and special interests that is Canada falling apart. Once the plains would join the US, British Columbia would be isolated from the rest of Canada, thus resulting in it becoming independent. British Columbia is extremely left-wing, likely being the most left-wing region of the North American continent, with socialists regularly in charge, and so joining America would be politically too jarring. It would work out for them anyway, since politically, economically, and culturally they're oriented towards Asia, with Vancouver being 40% Asian, and much of their trade coming from Asia. Vancouver, with the rest of British Columbia as an extension, would do fine as a city-state. Meanwhile, on the other side of Canada, with Quebec gone, the Maritimes would be isolated from the rest of Canada. The Maritimes are left-wing but don't have the immense pride of British Columbia or Ontario that would make annexation by the US impossible. Also, they don't have a tremendous amount of trade connection to America either. I could either see them becoming independent, part of Ontario, part of an Ontario-based nation, or joining the US, with the last being plausible if the US is in a golden age. And that all leaves Ontario, who would probably keep the various Arctic territories, with the exception of the Yukon that would probably join the US for ease of connection to Alaska. Ontario is the seat of Canadian left-wing nationalism, and so would be unable to join the US out of pride. However, Ontario's geography in the center of the continent lends itself well to this situation of being part and yet not part of the American system. Like many micro-European nations, it could structure its economy around providing services the US wouldn't like certain drugs, low taxes, manufacturing, or the like. However, an important thing to consider is that even though places like Ontario, Quebec, or British Columbia might be technically independent, they'd be so economically, politically, and militarily dependent upon the US that in real terms there's no way they could be anything except puppet states. To take a bird's eye view, Canada almost certainly won't survive the next few centuries without annexation by the US, since it has none of the factors that keep countries alive, whether strong geography, national identity, a warlike tradition, or importance to the international balance of power. The only thing that has prevented Canada's annexation by the US, in real terms to be brutally harsh, is entropy. For clarification, this is a scenario that could play out. I don't know if it will, or even if it's the most likely option. For all its failings, Canada is still one of the most stable countries in the world in a very safe neighborhood, and so I think the chances it makes it to the 22nd century are pretty good. However, I wanted to explore this scenario that I don't see many other people cover.
What a Faltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pillar, Pearl, Patreon, the Free Peas. And as always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.